Welcome back, everyone. If you were with us last time, you witnessed a deal no human should ever make. Ken, a desperate salesman in Jakarta, bought an amulet for success, not knowing it contained the soul of a murdered woman. Name! He paid the price in nightmares and terror, and we all thought the story ended when her spirit was freed in a temple. But tonight we're going to learn the most terrifying rule of the supernatural. Some doors, once opened, can never be fully closed. This is what happened after the ritual. This is the chapter they don't warn you about. Chapter 6. The Inherited Curse. The month after the Guan Yu Temple was the calmest of Ken's life. Quiet. As if after a years-long storm, he had finally been washed up on a silent, deserted shore. He gave up the apartment with the view of a wall and moved into a modest but clean studio in a decent neighborhood. He returned to his old job, medical device sales. It wasn't torture anymore. Now it was just active. Neff. He burned incense in the mornings, not because he believed, but because the scent of sandalwood overwrote the memory of that sweetish smell of decay. He donated money to the Buddhist temple, not praying for wealth, but simply paying down an invisible debt he hoped would one day be settled. And at night, he slept, lightly, fitfully, like a soldier after a war, but he slept. The nightmares didn't return. The weeping and the silence had stopped. It's over, he convinced himself, looking in the mirror at his still sunken but no longer insane eyes. I paid my price. This is the end. He was wrong. The first warning was an itch. It started on the inside of his left forearm, right where that fingerprint bruise had once been, the one that appeared out of nowhere during his success. The itch wasn't strong, but it was persistent, subcutaneous, as if something was moving under the epidermis. Ken blamed it on allergies, new soap, until one morning, showering, he raised his arm under the stream of hot water. The steam, the water, and the heat did their work. The skin on that spot, an area the size of a coin, turned white, not just lightened, but became unnaturally pale, thin, almost translucent, like old parchment. And through this thin skin, lines appeared, bluish-purple, thin as spiderwebs, intricate and flawlessly symmetrical. These weren't capillaries. This was a pattern, the very one. That same microscopic script he had seen on the dark scroll inside the glass cylinder. Nam's writings. They were now branded under his skin. Ken screamed. The sound that tore from his lips was so wild it frightened even him. He grabbed a rough loofah, soaked it into a thick lather, and began to scrub. Harder, harder, until it hurt, until he felt he was scrubbing off not just dirt, but some terrible, invisible scar. The skin reddened, inflamed, began to bleed. Soapy water with pinkish swirls ran down the drain. He rinsed the wound, squeezed his eyes shut, afraid to look, and looked. The skin was clean. A little raw, but clean. The pattern was gone. Imagination, he whispered, breathing heavily. Residual images. Psychosomatic. But deep down, he knew. Tangibly, physically knew. This wasn't imagination. This was a trace, like a scar from a burn that aches when the weather changes. Only this scar was from a burn not by fire, but by another's suffering, now fused into the fabric of his own being. The second warning was his voice. It happened a week later, during a crucial presentation. Not for surgeons, but for the board of a Japanese investment fund, looking for a partner to enter Indonesia's medtech market. Ken had prepared for a week. He was in his best, new, but understated suit. His slides were impeccable, and it was going perfectly. Numbers flowed, his arguments were ironclad. The Japanese gentlemen nodded with their stone faces, the highest sign of approval. And at the climax, as Ken spoke about social responsibility and the future of healthcare, his voice broke. Not into a cough, not into hoarseness. It changed. His own familiar baritone suddenly became thinner, piercingly high, and feminine. And it spoke in a completely different, guttural, melodic language. Thai. A phrase Ken didn't understand, but whose intonation he grasped immediately. It wasn't malice, not a threat. It was a cosmic, hopeless sorrow. The room fell into a silence so deep the hum of the air conditioner was audible. All 5 Japanese directors froze, their stone masks cracking to reveal bewilderment and primal discomfort. The translator blinked, unsuccessfully trying to place the words. Ken stood, feeling his own throat, his vocal cords burn. as if someone else had briefly rented his speech apparatus to voice something of their own, something festering. "Excuse me," he forced out in his own, now trembling voice. "My throat." Something caught. The presentation, of course, failed. The Japanese left quickly, politely, irrevocably. Back home, Ken didn't turn on the lights. He approached the mirror in the hallway, peered at his reflection in the semi-darkness. "Repeat it," he ordered himself. "What did you say?" He tried. First, he just opened his mouth. Then he attempted to reproduce the sound. And he succeeded. His tongue of its own accord took an unfamiliar position, hit his palate, his lips formed foreign shapes, and from his throat came the same sorrowful, high-pitched sound in Thai. He went online, found a translator, typed what he'd heard phonetically. The bot returned a result. "Why can no one see my pain?" Ken leaned back in his chair. This wasn't the voice of possession, not the voice of a threat. This was the voice of an echo, a reverberation of another's pain, now resonating somewhere in the cavities of his body, in his cellular memory, in his DNA, which perhaps already carried a minor, indelible mutation introduced by that cursed amulet. He wasn't possessed by Nam's spirit. He had assimilated her. As an organism assimilates a poison that becomes part of its metabolism. And it was at that moment, in the tomb-like silence of his studio, at 2 a.m, that someone knocked on the door. 3 slow, heavy thuds. Ken flinched. No one knew his new address. He slowly approached the door, looked through the peephole, and his heart sank into his heels. Standing outside was risky, but it wasn't the risky, groomed, predatory smelling of expensive cologne and secrets. This was his shadow. The man before the door was hunched in a dirty, crumpled shirt. His always perfectly styled hair hung in greasy gray strands. His face was covered in stubble and deep wrinkles that hadn't been there a month ago. But the worst part was his eyes. They were empty, cloudy, like a fish that had lain on market ice for 3 days. Ken, overcoming his horror, opened the door. "Risky. God, what happened to you?" Risky didn't enter. He just stood on the threshold, swaying on his feet like a drunk. He didn't smell of alcohol. He smelled of formalin and something else. "Tuna thait. Number 7. Like the smell of an abandoned refrigerator that had just been unplugged. "They're in us," Risky croaked. His voice was raspy, devoid of all life. "Do you understand? The shop didn't disappear because they ran away. They completed the sale. The last item. The final batch." He took a step forward, and Ken involuntarily stepped back. "We're not buyers, Ken. We're containers. Carriers. Incubators." "What are you talking about?" Ken's voice trembled again. "My amulet." Risky touched his chest absently, where the silver cylinder once hung. It grew dull. Then it cracked. And then I started to forget. He looked at Ken with his cloudy eyes, and a terrifying flash of awareness flickered in them for a second. First where my keys were, then my card pin, then my mother's birthday. And yesterday. Yesterday I looked in the mirror and didn't understand who it was. Who was this old man looking at me? "Risky, you need a doctor," Ken began. But Risky sharply interrupted him, and in his voice, 2 intonations suddenly sounded at once. His own, and superimposed over it, that same, feminine, sorrowful one. "She talks to me, your woman. Nam. She says that she and I are the same now, that he erased her skin. And me." Risky poked his finger at his own temple. "Erased memory. Soul. I was the first vessel, empty." He fell silent, catching his breath. Then suddenly turned, and without another word shuffled away down the corridor, dragging his feet. "Where are you going?" "Risky," Ken called after him. Risky stopped without turning. "Home," he replied with a childlike simplicity. "To watch the kettle boil. I think I used to like that." And he left, dissolving into the half-light of the stairwell. Ken closed the door, leaned his back against it, and slowly slid to the floor. His ears were ringing. He sat there for maybe an hour, maybe more, trying to make sense of the madness that had just occurred. He never went to bed. And in the morning brewing coffee, he mechanically opened the news feed on his phone and froze. The third top story: body of man found in elite Central Jakarta condominium. Suspected accident. Ken's fingers shook as he opened the article. There was no photo, but there was a name and a description. Risky Rahmat, 42 years old, found in his own bathroom. The bathtub was filled with water. Next to it on the floor stood an electric kettle turned on, but empty. But that wasn't the main detail. The main detail, which the journalist called a strange ritual element, possibly linked to depression, was the following. The man's body had been shaved bald, and on the skin of his head, face and back carefully, with surgical precision, complex geometric diagrams, symbols, and lines of unfamiliar script had been drawn in a brown iodine solution, like a blueprint, like assembly instructions. Might got me gushes. Or like a label on a product that had now been sent for disposal. Ken dropped his phone. The coffee cup shattered on the tiles, splashing dark droplets that looked like blood. He understood. Risky wasn't his savior or tempter. He was the control sample, the first in the batch, and his expiration date had run out, which meant that Ken's time was also ticking, and his packaging was already beginning to show its hidden markings. First, on the skin, then in the voice. What would be next? He raised his eyes to his reflection in the dark screen of the turned-off TV, and for a second he thought he saw, reflected in his own eyes, not his face, but the pale, sorrowful face of a woman, and her lips whispered, "You're next." But not the last. Chapter 7. The Blueprint on the Flesh. Ken thought Risky's death was the end of the line. He was wrong. It was just the first stop, and the markings on Risky's skin weren't a ritual. They were a message. For him. The iodine patterns haunted Ken. He saw them every time he closed his eyes. Geometric shapes, sharp angles, lines intersecting in ways that hurt his brain to visualize. They felt familiar. And the itch on his forearm returned 3 days later. This time, Ken didn't scrub. With a sense of grim inevitability, he took a bright LED flashlight, went into his pitch-black bathroom, and pressed the cold glass against his skin. Under the stark, sideways light, the skin on his forearm revealed raised welts, not the colorful script from before. These were pale, subcutaneous ridges, like scars forming from the inside out. And when he tilted his arm, the shadows they cast were unmistakable. The beginning of the same pattern that had been drawn on Risky's corpse. It wasn't a curse. It was a schematic, and his body was printing it. That night, the dream returned. But it was no longer Nam's memory. It was his own. Twisted. He was back in the occult shop, kneeling. But instead of throwing the moon blocks, he was holding a scalpel. The old shopkeeper was pointing not at the amulet, but at Ken's own bare chest. The woman whispered, her voice now a dry rustle in his mind. The contract is in the flesh. Always in the flesh. He woke with a gasp, his hand flying to his chest. Nothing. Yet. Desperate. He went to a private clinic, lying about a rash. The young doctor, bored, examined his arm under a dermatoscope. Subcutaneous fibrosis. Unusual pattern almost. Deliberate. Demendo. You into scarification? As the doctor leaned closer, the LED light of the scope reflecting in his pupil. Ken saw it. For a split second. The doctor's iris swirled with the same geometric pattern. A fleeting afterimage burned into Ken's retina. The doctor blinked, and it was gone. Anyway, use this cream, he said, handing Ken a tube, his eyes perfectly normal. Ken fled. The infection wasn't just on him. It was in his perception, warping reality around the curse. Chapter 8. The first symptom. The echoes. The human body has 79 organs. Ken was about to discover his had an 80th, an unwanted one that spoke with a stranger's voice. The echoes, as Ken came to call them, began in earnest. It wasn't just his voice slipping. It was his senses. Horror scene 1. Sound. In a silent meeting room, as a client droned on, Ken suddenly heard a second layer of sound underneath, a faint, rhythmic scratching, like fingernails on old leather. He glanced around. No one else reacted. He realized the sound was synced to the client's pulse in his own ears. When the man stressed a point, the scratching became frantic, desperate. Ken was hearing the man's biological stress translated into the sound of Nam's final struggles. Horror scene 2. Touch. Shaking hands with a new business partner, a wave of freezing cold shot up Ken's arm. But worse than the cold was the texture. The man's hand, to everyone else firm and warm, felt to Ken like wet, loose skin sliding over bone. He yanked his hand back, stammering an apology. The man looked offended. Ken's sense of touch was now translating the essence of people, their hidden decay, their moral rot into physical sensation. Horror scene 3. Sight, the crowning horror. The final echo was sight. He started seeing people's pain as light. A woman with migraines had a flickering, sickly yellow aura around her head. A man hiding grief had deep, pulsing indigo bruises in his chest. And once, in a crowded mall, he saw a man with a completely black, void-like hole where his heart should be. The man caught Ken staring and smiled, a smile that didn't reach his dead, lightless eyes. Ken knew with absolute certainty he was looking at another buyer, another container. They exchanged a glance of mutual, terrible recognition before melting into the crowd. Ken was no longer just haunted. He was becoming a receiver, tuned to a frequency of suffering. The amulet had been a filter. Now the filter was gone, and the signal was flooding directly into his nervous system. Chapter 9. The Gathering of Vessels. They found him. Not the ghosts, the others like him. And they had a proposal, a final solution. A letter arrived. No stamp slid under his door. A single line of coordinates and a time. Midnight. The old Dutch cemetery in northern Jakarta. Driven by a mix of terror and desperate hope, Ken went. The cemetery was a forgotten place, swallowed by vines and colonial neglect. Under a crumbling stone arch, he found them. 3 people. Elena, a once beautiful Russian fashion photographer, now gaunt. Her gift had been for capturing perfect, irresistible beauty in her photos. Her punishment. Her own reflection now showed her skin covered in invisible, crawling ulcers only she could see and feel. David, a soft-spoken British accountant. His amulet promised mathematical intuition, the ability to see patterns in chaos. Now, he saw numbers and equations floating in the air around people, their lifespan countdowns, the statistical probability of their pain. He was going mad from the data. Sari, the youngest, an Indonesian university student who'd wanted to be popular. Her luck in social circles had turned into a hell where she could hear people's darkest, most fleeting thoughts about her as a constant, vicious whisper. "We're a support group," Elena said, her voice hollow, "for the terminally cursed." They called themselves Vessels. They'd found each other through the subtle signs, the auras, the shared nightmares, the feeling of being a walking scar. They believed the old shopkeepers were just middlemen. The real source, the artisan who created the amulets by binding the souls, was still out there. And their only chance was to find him and reverse the binding from the source. Horror scene. As they spoke, David suddenly flinched, staring at Ken's chest. "Your numbers. They just changed." He recited a string of digits, a countdown. "That's not a lifespan. That's an activation timer." Before Ken could ask, a searing pain exploded across his back. He ripped off his shirt. The others gasped. In the moonlight, the subcutaneous pattern on his back, previously invisible, now glowed with a faint, sickly bioluminescence. The blueprint was complete. And it was live. Their mission was no longer theoretical. Ken's body was the trigger. They had days, maybe hours, before the final transformation, whatever that was. Chapter 10. The Artisan's Workshop. They followed the pain to a place that shouldn't exist, and found not a monster, but the truth, which was so much worse. The coordinates from the Vessel's collective research cross-referencing David's cursed equations, Sari's overheard psychic fragments, and Elena's visions led not to a jungle hut, but to a nondescript warehouse in Jakarta's industrial Tanjung Priok port. It wasn't hidden, it was ignored. A cognitive blind spot. People's eyes just slid off it. They only found it by walking backward toward it, following the increasing agony in Ken's markings. Inside, it was sterile. Bright LED lights. Not an occult den, but a high-tech lab. Clean tables held spectral analyzers, DNA sequencers, and what looked like 3D bioprinters. And on the walls, screens flashed with complex data. Neural maps, emotional frequency waves, soul resonance charts. In the center stood a small, frail man in a lab coat. Doctor shows 5090 Arwan, not a shaman. A parapsychological biologist exiled from the academic world for his unethical theories. He turned, his eyes bright with scientific fervor, not malice. "You're here, Subject K7, he said, looking at Ken with pride. "The integration is proceeding beautifully. The somatic scripting is brilliant, isn't it?" This was the Artisan. And he wasn't binding souls out of spite. He was conducting the ultimate experiment. The revelation. The true horror. The amulets weren't traps. They were delivery systems. You don't house a ghost, Dr. Arwan explained excitedly. That's primitive? You download its traumatic memory complex, its pain, its skills, its emotional signature, into the host's neural and epigenetic framework. The ghost is just a data ghost, like a program. You, my subjects, are the hardware being upgraded. My God mean delicious. Tested. Risky wasn't a failed vessel. He was a formatted hard drive, cleared to make space. The patterns on his skin, a debugging log. And Ken? Ken was the flagship model. His echoes weren't a side effect. They were the primary function going live. He was becoming a living receiver for human suffering, a walking empathic antenna. Doctor shows 5090. Arwan's goal? To create perfect human lie detectors, negotiators, healers by force-feeding them a lifetime of condensed, traumatic empathy. You should be grateful, the doctor insisted. You're evolving. The final, bitter choice. David, the accountant, had brought a weapon, not a gun, but a high-powered EMP generator he'd built, designed to fry unshielded electronics. It could also scramble the delicate, artificially induced psychic fields in their brains. They had a choice. Destroy the lab and potentially scramble their own minds into vegetable states, killing the program, but possibly themselves. Or live on as Dr. Arwan's masterpieces, forever feeling the world's raw, screaming pain. Ken looked at the terrified faces of Elena, Sari, and David. He saw the glowing schematic on his own arms, a map of his own rewritten soul. He thought of Nam, not as a ghost, but as a data set of agony forever looping in his cells. He gave David a slow, grim nod. Do it. Chapter 11. The quiet aftermath. The bitter ending. They won. The machine was destroyed. The lab in ruins. But in a war against something written inside your own DNA, there are no victors. Only survivors. And some wounds are so deep they become who you are. The EMP blast was silent. A wave of pressure. A sudden smell of ozone and burnt almonds. And every light in the lab died. Doctor shows 5090. Arwan screamed, not in pain, but in the anguish of an artist watching his masterpiece slashed to ribbons. For Ken, it felt like the world turned inside out. A silent, internal scream. Then, Then, nothing. He woke up in a hospital days later. The police report called it an industrial accident. Gas leak. The others were there too, scattered in different wards, suffering from unexplained neuropathic shock and memory loss. The echoes were gone. The patterns on his skin faded to faint silvery scars. The world was blessedly, deafeningly dull. Colors were flat. Sounds were just sounds. Handshakes were just handshakes. He was free. The final scene. Years later, the camera shows a successful Ken, a partner at a small ethical consulting firm. He has a kind, understanding wife, a child, a house with a garden. The perfect picture of recovery. We follow him through a quiet evening. He helps with homework, laughs at a joke, kisses his wife goodnight. Then he goes to his home office. He closes the door. The smile melts from his face, leaving only a profound, weathered exhaustion. He opens a locked drawer, not with fear, but with ritual. Inside are not mementos of terror, but tools. A white noise machine. A pair of blue light blocking glasses. A bottle of high-dose supplements for neurological health. A journal. He opens the journal. It's not a diary of pain. It's a logbook. Day 1427. Emotional dampening holding at 62%. No parasitic empathy spikes. Auditory hallucinations. 2. Both resolved with focus. Sleep. 4. 5 hours. Nightmare frequency. Acceptable. He puts on the glasses, turns on the white noise, a constant, gentle, shushing sound. He takes his pills. He sits in the dark, not meditating, just mourning, tearing, holding the line, keeping the void of his former gift at bay. His wife peeks in, concerned. He forces the warm smile back onto his face. Just winding down, love. She smiles back, believing him, and closes the door. The camera holds on his face as the smile fades again. He looks not haunted, but hollowed out. A man meticulously managing a permanent invisible disability. He traded screaming ghosts for a lifelong silent quarantine from his own fullest humanity. We think of curses as things that shout, that chase, that claw at the walls. We never consider the most successful curse of all, the one that wins not by breaking you, but by becoming so seamlessly woven into the fabric of your being that you can never truly remove it. You can only build a life around the empty, silent space where it lives. Ken didn't defeat the darkness. He made a permanent peace treaty with it. And the terms of that treaty require him to pay in small, quiet installments every single day for the rest of his life. The ultimate price for a shortcut isn't a single moment of terror. It's a lifetime of careful, quiet management. So the next time you're offered a door to a faster, easier path, ask yourself, bank is simple from Jewies. Are you prepared for what you'll have to carry with you long after that door is closed?